was a quiet evening in Glenview, Illinois, in 1993. Tricia Pacaccio, 18, returned from a late night out with friends. The sky was overcast, the street empty, and the soft hum of distant traffic was the only sound. Her shoes clicked against the concrete as she approached her home, and in her hand, the key that would never open her front door. Her parents, inside, assumed she was safely home. A small kitchen light flickered on, the sound of a television in the living room creating an illusion of normalcy. Outside, something waited in the shadows. Tricia never made it past the first step. She was found the next morning, lying on the doorstep, her small body still and pale, a violent end shrouding the ordinary neighborhood in terror. Tricia's father was the first to notice. The door was unlocked, or perhaps ajar. The familiar jingle of keys had not been heard. When he stepped outside, he froze. Her body was there, her backpack, a silent witness, blood dark and congealing in the early morning chill. He called for help, his voice shaking, echoing down the empty street. Neighbors began to gather, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Everyone struggled to reconcile the idea of such violence in their quiet, safe town. Who could do this? They whispered. For the families, the sense of security that had once defined their lives was shattered forever. The police arrived, examined the scene, but there were few clues. Tricia's attack had been swift, methodical, leaving no one to witness the horror as it happened. In the following days, the community tried to make sense of it. Tricia had been cautious, careful, aware of her surroundings. Yet someone had struck in the silence, someone who had studied her habits and moved unseen. Her friends remembered the last time they had been together, the way she laughed, the way she had promised to be home early. That promise had been broken in the most tragic way. The investigators worked tirelessly, but with so few leads, the case would grow cold. Families whispered about strangers, shadows, and the monsters that could hide in plain sight. Tricia's death became a silent ache, a hole in the town that no one could fill. The investigation into Tricia's death began immediately, but the trail was cold, almost from the start. Detectives scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions, piecing together timelines. But no one had seen or heard anything unusual. A small town, tightly knit, was suddenly filled with fear and suspicion. Friends of Tricia recounted the last moments they had spent with her. Laughter, fading into memory, the ordinary steps that had become final steps. Every corner, every shadow of the quiet streets was now examined. Police reviewed similar incidents across Illinois, trying to find a pattern. They looked for strangers, for anyone who had been always around. Yet the case grew colder, a haunting presence that could not be captured, a crime that seemed almost invisible. Fast forward to February 2001, Los Angeles, California. Ashley Ellerin was 21, full of life, ambition, and dreams. A student of fashion design, she lived in a small bungalow in Hollywood, surrounded by the city's chaotic energy. But her apartment felt like a sanctuary. She loved the nights she spent with friends, planning for the future, preparing outfits, imagining a life that had endless possibilities. On that evening, she prepared for a date. A white blouse carefully pressed, a scent of perfume lingering in the air, her hair falling perfectly over her shoulders. She had a smile, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of her evening would be violently interrupted. Ashley was not alone in the apartment building, yet that evening, the quiet made her vulnerable. Friends had left. The hallways were empty. A neighbor later recalled seeing a figure lurking nearby, someone carrying tools, someone who looked ordinary enough to be dismissed, a handyman, a neighbor, a stranger. No one paid him any attention. Inside, Ashley went about her routine, unaware that a presence had entered her space, studying her habits, familiarizing himself with the environment. He waited. Then, swiftly, brutally, he attacked. 47 stab wounds. Her throat was slashed in a single, violent motion that indicated rage and precision at once. Every wound spoke of a methodical, calculated force, someone who knew exactly what he wanted to inflict. The next morning, Ashley's roommate found her. The apartment was silent, but for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The scene was horrifying. Her body lay in the kitchen, the white blouse stained red, blood splattered across the counter and floor. It was clear she had struggled, but the violence had been overwhelming. Neighbors remembered hearing nothing except, perhaps, the faint scrape of a chair or the subtle sound of something falling, easily ignored in a busy city. Yet for those who knew Ashley, the image of her smile, her laughter, the hope in her eyes, made the scene unbearable. The apartment became a crime scene, a stage frozen in violence, and a city that never truly sleeps suddenly felt too large, too cold, and mercilessly indifferent. Friends, family, and classmates of Ashley were left grappling with grief and disbelief. Her mother remembered the last phone call. Ashley had laughed, spoke of her excitement, her plans, her dreams. The tragedy was unbearable because it was so ordinary. Ashley had done nothing wrong, had taken no risks beyond what any young adult does, and yet she had become the target of unimaginable violence. For the community, this crime transformed everyday spaces, the familiar hallways, stairwells, and doorways, into potential dangers. It reminded them that the city could hide predators in plain sight, and that tragedy could strike without warning, without reason. Years later, in 2005, the pattern became clearer with the murder of Maria Bruno in El Monte. Maria was a devoted mother of 4, living quietly in a modest apartment complex. One night, she slept while a shadow entered her home. The assailant struck with precision, inflicting multiple stab wounds, leaving her life extinguished in a cruel, silent act. Neighbors later recalled the faint sound of movement, perhaps a door quietly closing, or a chair scraping against the floor. A small piece of blue medical-grade fabric was found at the scene, an unusual, telling detail that suggested planning and familiarity with certain environments. It was subtle, but crucial. It was 2008 in Santa Monica. Michelle Murphy lived alone in a quiet apartment, believing she was safe in her familiar surroundings. That night, the darkness held an unseen threat. She awoke to the presence of a man in her bedroom, a knife glinting in the faint light. Panic surged, but instinct took over. Michelle struggled fiercely. She fought, scratched, and grabbed at the knife, refusing to surrender. The attacker, skilled and relentless, slashed at her repeatedly, leaving cuts on her arms and shoulders. Each movement was calculated, precise, a battle of survival against a predator who had studied her habits. In the chaos, he cut himself, leaving blood behind, small but definitive, When Michelle was found by neighbors the next morning, she was shaken but alive. The blood she left behind, combined with her description of the attacker, became the first tangible link in a chain of unsolved murders. Police collected DNA from the blood, and for the first time, the invisible threat began to take a form, a name, a face, a history that stretched across states and years. For the investigators, everything suddenly fit into a pattern. Young women attacked at night, often in their own homes, each incident meticulously planned. Illinois, Los Angeles, shadows moving unnoticed. Ordinary lives interrupted by extraordinary violence. The news of Michelle's survival sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Families, friends, and neighbors realized the danger had been closer than anyone imagined. The quiet city streets and familiar apartments were no longer entirely safe. People began recounting small, seemingly trivial observations from years before. A man always nearby, someone offering help with repairs, an ordinary face that seemed to belong in the background. Victims' families, too, were reminded of their own losses. Ashley's parents, Maria's children, Tricia's family. They saw the same thread of cruelty weaving through different lives. The predator was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He had always been among them. As police connected the dots, a disturbing picture emerged. The man who had struck repeatedly was methodical, meticulous, and patient. He observed, waited, learned the routines of his victims. He was familiar, ordinary, and unremarkable, in appearance someone no one would suspect. His pattern revealed a cruel intelligence. He was known in the community as helpful, polite, even charming. He offered assistance, carried tools, and ingratiated himself with neighbors. But this facade hid a darker truth. A killer who stalked his victims, studied their lives, and chose his moments with chilling precision. With Michelle's testimony and DNA evidence, investigators finally had a name: Michael Gargiulo. He was linked to multiple murders and the attempted murder across years and states: Illinois, Los Angeles. The cases once thought isolated now formed a horrifying web. The families of Tricia, Ashley, and Maria felt a mixture of relief and continued grief. The man who had stolen their loved ones' lives had been identified, yet the trauma remained. Michelle's survival had broken the chain, providing the proof necessary to finally hold the perpetrator accountable. Now, the focus shifts to the killer himself. Michael Gargiulo, known in his neighborhood as helpful, polite, and ordinary, had lived a dual life. He had studied his victims' movements, gained their trust, and exploited ordinary access to strike when and where he chose. His method was consistent: entry through doors left unlocked or easily opened, repeated stabbing with precision, and an escalation of violence that showed both control and rage. Witnesses recalled subtle details: a neighbor always nearby, a handyman who appeared in the right place at the right time, his presence comforting, yet imperceptibly threatening. The pattern of his crimes demonstrated patience and obsession, and the DNA from Michelle's struggle finally tied him to all known incidents. In 2019, the trial began. Families recounted their losses. Survivors testified to terror and survival. Prosecutors painted a picture of a sadistic, thrill-seeking killer. Gargiulo remained calm, almost detached, as the evidence mounted: DNA, victim testimony, repeated patterns of murder, and attempted murder. The jury deliberated, understanding the scope of his cruelty. 2 states, multiple victims, a history of planned, violent attacks, all pointed to a calculated, relentless predator. When the verdict was delivered, it was a moment of justice for the victims, families, and survivors. Guilty on all counts, with a death sentence imposed.